We turn now to the topic of the Iraq War, whistleblowing, how the U.S. routinely carries out foreign policy, and the lessons not learned. We're joined from Turkey by Katharine Gun, a former GCHQ translator, who leaked a memo from the National Security Agency in a courageous effort to stop the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and whose story is now the subject of a major motion picture playing in U.S. cinemas. And from the Bay Area in California, we're joined by Daniel Ellsberg, leaker of the Pentagon Papers, in an effort to end a war already started in Vietnam, and ever since a staunch defender of whistleblowing and whistleblowers. Thank you, Katharine and Dan, for joining us on CN Live.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, Katharine, let's begin with you. Your story, unfortunately, is not well known in the United States, and this film, I think, a very powerful film, is doing its part to spread that story. I want to know if you've probably been asked this before, can you concisely in a minute tell us what happened, what you did?
I was working at GCHQ, which is a government communication headquarters, the equivalent of the NSA. I was a Mandarin linguist and translator and analyst. And at the time, the Iraq War was brewing, and there was an email that was sent from NSA to GCHQ, which was requesting GCHQ to help them intercept the communications of the UN Security Council delegates sitting on the 6 swing nations. And so when I saw that, I thought, this reveals what's going on behind the scenes, how the intelligence agencies are being manipulated and how they're trying to build a case for war and get legitimacy for it. And so I leaked it in the attempt to try and derail the run-up to the Iraq War, the invasion.
And what happened? What happened to you, and what was the effect of your leak?
Well, the leak eventually was published on the front pages of The Observer, which is a Sunday newspaper in the UK. And, when I saw the actual memo had been reprinted, it had been, on the front pages. And I thought, this basically means that, they'll be able to figure out exactly where it came from. And, I had this feeling that I had to confide in my line manager, because I didn't feel like I was able to carry on a kind of duplicitous lifestyle of going into work pretending I had nothing to do with it when in fact I had. So I confessed, and then eventually, they immediately arrested me on suspicion of breaking the Official Secrets Act, and then they bailed me for 8 months. And then at the end of 8 months, they decided to charge me, and they charged me for breaking the Official Secrets Act in November of 2003. And then 4 months later, they promptly dropped the charges against me. So that's pretty much what happened.
The Observer reported, did you have direct contact with him, or was the memo given to him through another party?
I passed it on to a contact who then passed it on to somebody that they'd met. And that was Yvonne Ridley, who was a rather famous journalist in 2001 who'd been captured by the Taliban when she'd kind of smuggled herself into Afghanistan. And she converted to Islam after that. And so, she didn't really want to publish the story herself, because she knew that, people had sort of various assumptions about her. So she passed it on to Martin Bright, who is a friend of hers.
And you had no control. That reminds me of Dan's story about when he gave the papers to the Times, and he lost control of what they did with it, and he was frustrated not hearing from them. Dan, I wonder if you could tell us about that, and also give us your opinion, which you've said before, about what Katharine Gun did.
I was reading last night the new edition of the Spy Who Tried to Stop a War, which I'd read when it first came out almost a decade ago. And a number of questions arose to me. I was newly impressed by the bravery, but also in particular the timing that Katharine showed, whereas I put out information that I had known to be false, assurances by the president years earlier. 5 years earlier than I gave it to the Senate, that the president had lied. I waited that long, and thus the war was on. It's very, very hard to stop a war once it's going on, and I didn't actually stop the war. It continued. But in Katharine's case, she had every reason to believe, I think, that she could stop a war that had not yet occurred. And Katharine, there were a couple of questions, if I may ask you, that arose in my mind. It's related to what Joe has asked me here too. First of all, did you in fact expect to remain anonymous? I didn't, by the way, expect that for reasons I don't need to go into now. That wasn't an issue. In your case, did you hope and expect actually to remain anonymous when you gave it?
Yeah, to be frank, I did, because, I didn't tell anybody before I, posted the email onto this contact. I didn't tell my husband, I didn't tell anybody, obviously, in my office. And, I kind of assumed that when if it would ever be published, I was assuming that perhaps it would just be kind of summarized in a report. And, with this kind of usual type of attribution, which is like, sources reveal or, something like that. But subsequently, now that I know how difficult it was for them to actually even get it published at the Observer, and they wanted it to have a big impact, I now realize that wouldn't have worked. If it had just been a sort of summary of an article and they sort of hinted at this possible memo that they had possession of, then it would not have made any waves whatsoever.
But Katharine, do you think it would have made a difference to your own vulnerability here if they had simply summarized it? There would still have been a great search for the leaker, and you would have had to either lie, which you did at first and then couldn't live with, or tell yourself. Didn't you? Would it really have made a big difference if they had done what you expected and simply summarized it?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. It depends how they had summarized it and how they'd, released the information. But as it's
the reason I asked the question is, if you had realized from the beginning that you would be known and you would be subject to the Official Secrets Act, I wonder if that wouldn't have put in your head the thought that you could go directly to the press yourself, not, if you found out who to talk to, or to Parliament, conceivably to Robin Cook or to Claire Short, who was known to be opposing the war. And that's related to another question. Did you, as the book suggests by Martha Mitchell, really believe, reasonably, that with the evidence of illegality means coming out and the illegality of the war, that Britain and Blair would not go to war if they understood that if the public knew that it was illegal? Did you believe that would stop them from going?
Well, I guess you could say I was fairly naive. I was 27.
Well, I'm not saying that was a naive belief. I'm asking simply if that's what you thought. Actually, if they obeyed the law, that's what they would have done.
I think if, I don't know, looking back on it, I think if MPs had actually taken that paper, the front pages of that newspaper, into Parliament and waved it, under the nose of Tony Blair and said, look, Tony, what's this? Tell us what's going on here. Who authorized this? Why is GCHQ taking orders from NSA? What's going on? If there had been more of a stink, then something might have happened. Mm-hmm. But there wasn't. There was nothing.
Well, comparing it to my own situation, on the one hand, as I've often said, I regret very much that I did not do in 1964 what you did right away when you read that, and go to Congress, go to the press with what I knew in my safe at the Pentagon. The president was lying to the public about the Tonkin Gulf incident and about his preparations. So I believe actually before the war, that had a pretty good chance of averting that war. And so I missed that deadline by a matter of years. Now, in your case, looking just with a war coming, looking like just a month away at most, which it was when you released this information, it occurred to me, having seen the film again and admiring again so much what you did do and what the newspapers did, they had a problem of trying to authenticate this, as you know, which is revealed in the movie and the book, which delayed by about 3 weeks at a very crucial time. They're coming out with the story. Giuliani quoted, and Martin Bright is quoted saying, "I wish we'd gone with it earlier," and so forth. And it just occurred to me, and this is not a criticism of you, but looking at what if they had had you and not Yvonne Ridley, or you with the actual document rather than a scrap of paper, basically with something torn off, they wouldn't have had that authentication problem from the beginning, and it would have saved several weeks. And my guess is that you would have done that if you had realized that you couldn't really remain anonymous and that you were biting the bullet. And am I wrong in thinking you would have gone ahead anyway if you had realized, or not?
I don't know. I really don't know.
Anyway.
It's all conjecture.
Yeah, okay, sorry, but those are just questions that were raised in my mind. As I say, I now look back and say, could have made a difference if I'd done it earlier. And it might have made a difference if you'd gone forward earlier, but that's just a lesson for later whistleblowers. That's the reason I'm really raising this, not to hack over what we might have done, but what could you say, what could I say from your experience and my own to future whistleblowers? And here's what I would draw, including from our conversation just now. I would say to them, don't tell the IG, the Inspector General, the whistleblower has currently, that we're reading about in the news, did that with the Ukrainian conversation and the other acts. And he, appears to be he, went to the IG, the Inspector General, and went through channels. And it isn't out. We don't yet know that whole whistleblower complaint. And that's true for so many whistleblowers like Tom Drake and others. And myself. I delayed having given to the Senate for 1.5 years before it came out in the newspapers. They sat on it. So what I'm saying is, consider going right away to the newspapers anonymously if it's possible, but consider doing it even if you know you will be known, because as you were so concerned, Katharine, a war's worth of lives is at stake, and it can be worth a very great penalty in your own personal terms to do it. And if you want to be effective, go to the media right away, and with Parliament as well, Congress, at the same time. Don't go through channels, and do be willing to be identified if you really want to save time and have this effective.
Katharine didn't go through channels. She did go directly to the press. Were there channels at the GCHQ at the time?
Yeah, there are, but they're just rubber stamping mechanisms.
You knew you would get nowhere.
Well, I
want to ask you. Yes,
she's certainly right about that. It would not have gotten anywhere.
Right.
And in fact, the movie shows, I take it truly, that you eventually did go to your own representative in Parliament. But had you done that in the beginning, gone to your own representative, what's the chance that he would have put his career on the line by calling?
Well, my MP was, as it happened, was a member of the Liberal Democrats, and at the time, back in 2003, they were strongly against the war, the Liberal Democrats in the UK. So it's possible, but he would have advised me not to break the official secrets out. I'm sure that would have been his duty. And going, as I say, internally, it would only have flagged me up as a potential troublemaker, and nothing would have come of that either. But you say very much go directly to the press, and well, recently I've read a book which hopefully will be published before the end of this year, which is specifically about what whistleblowers should do and how they should go about it, and it advises whistleblowers not to go internally, because as we've all concluded, it generally doesn't work. But if you are going to do it anonymously, you've got to be, if you're willing to come out, but the risks are tremendous, as we've seen, the risks are horrendous for coming out publicly. You really must remain anonymous, and that is an extremely difficult task to do. And in the UK, as you were saying about should I have gone directly to the press or the parliament or so on, but I don't know whether any of you are particularly familiar with the case of Dr. David Kelly, but as I understand it, he did go to the press. And Dr. David Kelly was a British UN weapons inspector. And he went to the press and said that the government's claims of these, 40 minutes of Iraq being able to do what? I don't know what, but, the 40-minute claim. And he said it was a sexed up dossier, this dossier that had been produced. And then, he was grilled in front of the parliamentary committees, and later he ended up, for all we know, killed, but it was ruled to be suicide. So, I think we have to be extremely careful when encouraging people to take such big risks.
Oh, wow. I'm glad we don't want to go down the road of the Kelly death, but I interviewed him actually at the time.
Did you?
Yes, I did, because I was covering the UN in those days, and that's what I want to talk to you about now, the reaction to what you did and the role of the press here. It did not stop the war. And it got a lot less reaction, particularly in the US, than, of course, Dan's leak did. But what can you tell us about the role of the press in facilitating the invasion of Iraq and how they failed you, basically?
Are you asking me?
Katharine, yes.
Right. I'm sure there's, a good amount of research that's been done since about the role of the press and how basically it fell pretty much in lockstep with war plans. And so, this is generally what happens, unfortunately, is that when a war is proposed by the government for whatever reason, sooner or later, all the mainstream newspapers come on board and they support whatever the government is proposing to do. And that's exactly what happened in the Iraq case. I think, there was a very well-known, prominent BBC reporter, a reporter by the name of Raghi Omar, who was reporting from Iraq. This was after the invasion, but it's my understanding that he was asked to leave by the BBC because he was supposedly, his reports were not unbiased enough. He was speaking too much from the point of view of the Iraqis, it was said. So, it's a very problematic situation that I think, mainstream press has essentially shot themselves in the foot because, for years and years we've seen that this is what they do, and the public can see it now. We can see that this is what they do. And so that's why there's been this tremendous backlash towards the mainstream media and this fall in their viewing figures and their newspapers' purchase numbers.
Before we go to Elizabeth, I just wanted to add this story, which is in no way near on the same scale as what you and Dan have done, but I was covering the UN in the lead up to the war. I remember talking to Ambassador Zinzer of Mexico, I want to talk to you about in a second, and the reaction to your story. And I was writing my stories from the point of view of the Germans and the French and the Russians who were opposing this resolution, and it was clear they weren't going to get it. And I was writing for a chain in Canada that published the Montreal Gazette and the Ottawa Citizen and other papers, and the foreign editor of that chain called me to tell me that his son was a Marine, a Canadian Marine, and that I had to support the war. I said, sorry, that's not my job. My job is to report what's going on at the council, and it's clear they're not getting the resolution. And I'm not highlighting only the British and American positions, but the Germans and the French and others who were opposing this resolution. And the day of the invasion, which was a very dark day for me and for many, many people around the world, obviously, millions who came out in the street to protest that war, I was let go from that position, told that I was, that was a financial thing. So you could not stand up to that war. Elizabeth, but then we want to go back to the press and the reaction at the UN with the Mexican ambassador Zinzer, who maybe had a fate similar to Dr. Kelly's. Elizabeth.
Yeah, I was wanting to ask you, on the same train of thought about the media, about how within this context of the media across the board, in the West in general, basically silencing journalists who wanted to or were, writing from that perspective that was less pro gung-ho for war. Do you think that that equally played a role in the way that the United States press did not cover your story in terms of, because the excuse at the time we know was, as Dan mentioned earlier, was authentication issues. But do you think that was at all genuine, or do you think it was just basically a pretext to ignore your story completely?
There's no proof, right? We can't prove whether they were called off the story or not. So it's speculation, but it does seem remarkable, right? It seems remarkable that they wouldn't cover the story once the spelling thing had been explained, right? But the news, the 24-hour news cycle goes so fast, and before you know it, it's something else. And as it happened, that was published on the 2nd of March, and I think it was the 5th of March when Colin Powell gave the speech to the UN. And once he did that, it was basically a fait accompli, because the whole thing just fell into place. I've subsequently, I've had words, and I'm sure perhaps you guys have too, with Larry Wilkerson, who helped to formulate Colin Powell's speech at the UN. And, as we know, he is extremely full of regret that he actually participated in that. He wished that he'd actually walked away from that process.
Powell's vile display is what I call it. He displayed a vial of supposedly of anthrax. I recall at that time also speaking to Jeremy Greenstock, who was the British ambassador to the UN, and later became number 2 under Bremer in Iraq. But I asked him when we peeled away from the pile of reporters, why now? The situation on the ground hadn't fundamentally changed for years. UNSCOM and later the successive weapons inspectors had found some stuff, but it really kept searching. They had no definitive proof of any WMD. Why now is this push for war? And he said to me, because Washington wants it. And I think that spoke volumes about the relationship between Britain and the U.S. at that time, the Blair-Bush relationship. But I wanted to ask you about, how did you react to the lack of reaction at the UN to this? Because the attitude at the UN is everybody does this. Everybody's spying on one another. And even though, the blackmailing and all that, and I want to get into what Dan raised earlier about Ukraine, because I think it ties in, that this is the routine way U.S. conducts foreign policy, through threats, intimidation, blackmail, and bribes. And we can go back to the first Gulf War, 1991. A colleague of mine then, I think Dan probably knows it, Phyllis Bennis, wrote a terrific book called Calling the Shots, and she explained how the U.S. used all those threats and intimidation to get the votes for the first Gulf War. And the Yemen was told that was the most expensive no vote you've ever made in your life, and they had to pay with the aid. The U.S. has used this. I did a piece with the Boston Globe explaining how the U.S. was withdrawing financial aid to get countries to give immunity to U.S. troops when the ICC was being negotiated, and on and on. And now we've seen, of course, the story about Ukraine, but let's hold off on that for a second. Mexican Ambassador Zinser, he talked to us outside the Security Council about your story and what was going on. And of course, he was very much against the war, but most of the diplomats, Catherine, there would not say anything, even ones who opposed the war, either out of fear of upsetting the U.S., not having instructions to do so from their capitals. But of course, Zinser was then fired, and the U.S. got him fired. And he wound up a year and a half later dying in a car accident in Mexico. What were you keenly looking at how the Security Council was reacting to this? And what was your reaction then?
Well, I'm afraid my reaction to the actual when the story came out and the sort of fallout from it, I wasn't taking a lot of it in because I was in such turmoil myself. I was in a terrible state, and in a way that was my mistake for not confiding in anyone. But I had no idea who to turn to. I had no idea who I could trust. So I had nobody I could turn to and say, look, now what do I do? I'm shaking with fear. What do I do? And I couldn't tell my parents. They were over on the other side of the world. I didn't want to get my husband involved, because I just thought if I tell anybody, they would be subject to the OSA, so I didn't want to implicate anybody. So I wasn't very much aware. Apart from I was angry, that people were so blasé about the whole thing, because this is about, this is not about trade deals, right? It's not about negotiating policy. This is about war and peace and people's lives. And, and the whole Iraq war has been the biggest scar, I think, in this 21st century.
And they did go after your husband, didn't they, as the film shows?
Well, no, that actually, a lot of people have said that in the media, and since they've watched the film, and it's not explained in the film because how can you? But it was more or less a parallel process, so it wasn't a direct retaliation. He had been going through the asylum seeking process, and he'd been rejected. So it was kind of an automatic thing that he was going to be deported. The interesting thing is that had I not actually been charged by that point, had I not been facing charges, they would have deported him.
And you got your MP to help. That's what the film shows, not to stop the war, but to help your husband.
In the end, I involved my MP because we had actually met him before on the whole issue of our marriage and his residency status. But it was kind of the silver lining to this whole thing that I faced, is that he wasn't deported. If I'd been at work that day, I would have come home and found him gone, and that's kind of serendipity.
Yeah, ironic. Before I go back to Dan, you mentioned the spelling thing previously. I want to explain that this may or may not have been the reason why the press didn't cover your story so much, especially in the U.S., because the memo that you have, the NSA, was retyped by an editorial assistant. She put it through a spell check, and it turned it into British spellings. And then the Drudge Report said that this is a fake, because NSA would never spell with British spellings. Of course, even after it was shown that was an error by that editorial assistant, this still was not the kind of resonance that your story should have deserved. Dan, you mentioned Ukraine, and I was talking about how the U.S. routinely carries out foreign policy. And I will add to the litany I gave before that WikiLeaks, in their Cablegate releases, showed that at the UN, that they were taking biometric data from Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General, that they were bugging many, many missions of the countries in New York. And again, the attitude I remember was, we all do it. So they didn't want to make a stink about it because they could be exposed, those governments. So Dan, we see here in this Ukraine issue, which is leading to an impeachment of the president of the United States, that he tried to get an investigation of Joe Biden, the vice president, and his activities in Ukraine by supposedly holding back military aid to Ukraine to get just what we're talking about, playing with aid to try to get people to do that. Now, what's missing from this story, Dan, I don't know if you're going to agree with me on this or not, because we've had conversations before, is that the first crime here was the U.S. backed a illegal overthrow of an elected government in Ukraine. That's not even being mentioned. Number two, after that coup, as booty from that coup, the sitting vice president's son goes on the board of the largest gas and oil producer in Ukraine. That's a little bit fishy. So in my view, that should be investigated. Now, of course, it's tied to the fact that Biden is one of the leading Democratic contenders against Trump. So it looks like it's a political move, not just an issue of getting to corruption. And also, I should add, Dan, that Joe Biden on a stage some year or so ago openly said that he withheld a $1 billion credit line to the previous President Poroshenko of Ukraine if he didn't agree to fire the prosecutor who was looking into this very company on which his son was installed on the board. So this whole thing is a mess, and everybody looks bad, in my opinion. Dan?
I think we can assume that Donald Trump was not acting out of a gut revulsion at the idea of corruption in the Ukraine, as he's been saying, and that this very specific corruption that he wants to find and wants help in finding would damage his leading opponent in the 2020 election. But as you say, this is nothing new. When actually, we didn't know it at the time, but Nixon not only tried to get elected in 1968 with the help of a foreign power, namely Thieu, President Thieu in Vietnam, in urging him not to take part in negotiations that President Johnson had just announced. That almost surely did make the difference in that very close run election. In other words, interfering with negotiations to end a war, actually, supposedly, whether or not I would have done that. Interfering with those negotiations in order for Nixon to win the election, not to let the Nixon-Humphrey administration, and he was opposing Humphrey in the campaign, get the credit for ending a war. That was regarded by the president as treason at the time, but for various reasons didn't come out. Obviously, more, I would say, considerably more serious than we're talking now. It's exactly what, and I know you've been opposing this all the time, it's exactly what Trump was accused of doing in connection with Russia in the 2016 campaign, or at least colluding. And they have not proven the direct collusion in that. Then Reagan, again, won an election by convincing informally the Iranians not to release captives in 1980. So the idea of using, at least for a candidate, especially a Republican candidate, it seems, to interfere with foreign policy in order to win an election is not new. But in this case, what Katharine had, may I say, was the evidence of the U.S. using illegal means, whether they're done all the time. The American public is not too conscious of it, as the UN representatives were, of course, but a big difference in the US and UK and the rest of the countries had to do with concern about the legality of the war. And that depended, to make it legal at all, depended on affecting those 6 swing votes, and thereby discouraging Russia and China or France from exercising a veto on the war. They could have vetoed it, and then the war would have been illegal in terms of the UN Charter in any case. But the hope of the US was that if they could get a majority, including the non-permanent members, to vote for it, they could move against the UN Charter and go ahead even in face of a veto, and preferably even dissuade Russia and China from issuing a veto on France. Now, that all depended on whether you cared, whether it was legal or not. The U.S. didn't begin to. Cheney was in no way in favor of going for a UN vote. It was Powell who said, let's try to make it legal and get a UN vote out of this. And of course, when they didn't get the vote, thanks to Katharine, almost 100%, they did go ahead without it, as they were determined to do. But that was more of a problem for Blair, because Blair had said that he would not go ahead without a resolution, and the law was entirely on that side. The Goldsmith memo, the one-page memo that he delivered on March 17th, was without merit legally, and every lawyer in Britain basically knew that, starting with the main Foreign Service legal officer, Elizabeth Wilmshurst. And she was capable of telling, but they
yeah, but she resigned.
Yeah, so she had said in her letter of resignation, implied strongly that Goldsmith had changed his opinion. It wasn't just a change of opinion, changed his opinion from a sound legal argument that there was no legality without a second resolution, to a meritless opinion of law. Now, the British were concerned about that. One of the highest military officers in Britain said, I don't want to be in a cell next to Milosevic at The Hague. You won't have heard in history any American general have expressed such a concern. We don't even accept the jurisdiction of the court. In fact, it's a question in my mind. I take it that Britain did accept it. Is that right, Katharine? I think
we are signed up to it, I think. Yeah.
I don't know, but my guess is that they did accept the jurisdiction, and certainly that was a worry in their mind. I learned from the book, actually, just last night, that the original Goldsmith opinion earlier had been that there was a genuine danger of British officials ending up in a criminal prosecution as a result of this, and an even much greater danger, at least, of the case being made, the indictment being brought. That wasn't any concern in the U.S., you can assume at all. Now, Joe, when you said that the people were all very blasé about this at the UN, and you were there, you have to keep in mind, or that was not the case with the 6 swing votes, especially Mexico and Chile. Chile, having been subject to an overthrow of their democratic constitution and their way of life by the Pinochet coup, which was promoted by the U.S., was very, very sensitive to the idea that the NSA, the American Intelligence Community, was again strong-arming them for their vote. And that made it really impossible for them to go along. So the people who were not blasé were the people whose votes counted for non-permanent members of the Security Council. They weren't blasé at all. Front page concern in their country, headlines in their country. Katharine's revelation, even late in the game, made it impossible for them to get that second vote. And remember, I asked earlier whether she thought that would keep Britain from coming in at all. She might well have thought that as a good patriotic Britisher here, that our government wouldn't do something blatantly illegal. And I think to be wrong about that is not to be naive. It's I'm 88. It took me quite a while to discover that about my country. And she may not have realized that at that time. She didn't keep Britain from coming in because Britain, Blair, wanted to be the closest ally of the U.S. He may or may not have liked the cartoons of him as a poodle, but he wanted the U.S. to regard him as their poodle and to pat his head and feed him the best food and cut his hair, very nicely. And that's what he wanted. Interesting comparison to The Observer. Now, The Observer had this kind of information from Ed Vulliamy. That appears in the movie very clearly. It's true. Vulliamy had been saying there is no evidence of WMDs. That's all a hoax.
Back in 2002.
Hey?
Way back in 2002.
Right. And actually, Katharine, it's very interesting. It doesn't come out sufficiently either in the movie or the book, but I take it from your interviews in this country. The answer to the question, how did Katharine Gun know that they were being hoaxed into war? You didn't start that when you read the cable. You already had the operation that's shown in the film. You're saying they're lying when you look at the TV. Where did you get that? I learned from the interviews, and I'm very pleased by this, from my friend Norman Solomon here in the Bay Area, who had written a book that you read on showing the lies and the real motives for coming into this. So that was an influence in another book, apparently, as well. So
Yeah.
you knew it, lots of people knew it, but the Observer, Vulliami's employer, not only did not run it, that's brought out in the film, they didn't run his stories because they supported the war, despite his stories. In other words, in effect, they either didn't believe him, that's probably not the case, or they wanted to support Blair because they had access to Blair. What is that access? The ability to be lied to in an unofficial background way, as they were being, which they could run as a scoop. High sources tell us, that. So they wanted to be close to Blair, just as Blair wanted to be close to the US in a war, which I now read, he really was reluctant to do. He knew that it was not only illegal, but a disaster. And so the difference here in the systems is you had a chance, I think a real chance, to keep Britain from taking part in the war by showing the illegal means and the bringing out the illegality of the war. And for that, you had to rely not just on Norman Solomon, who is not even a lawyer, but Goldsmith, and that meant Wilmshurst. In fact, something that I'm pretty sure of that doesn't come out in either the movie or the book by Martha Mitchell, didn't Ben Emerson in his day, just before the trial was to start on the 24th, when he asked for documents, did he not also present the prosecution with the prospect of bringing Elizabeth Wilmshurst, who had resigned from being the top legal officer in the Foreign Services, as a witness?
I'm not 100% clear on this. I know that Ben Emerson himself suspected that the reason was, I don't know whether he'd already had this conversation with Elizabeth Wilmshurst or not. As
in the film, you're not sure that took place as in the film?
No, that did take place. So well, I'm trying to remember exactly. I think, yeah. So we talked about he had suspicions. Then he must have gone and had this interview with Elizabeth Wilmshurst.
Well, I was told, actually, and this is the best of my memory, but I was told by Ben Emerson when I was over there that he had told them he was going to call Elizabeth Wilmshurst. Now, okay. he asked for documents, but they could refuse those documents, saying it's private, we never give out documents.
Yeah.
Very unlikely to get those documents. But Elizabeth Wilmshurst, I understand, who had not wanted to be as courageous, let's say, or take the risk that you took of her career by coming right out publicly and saying what she had said, what her judgments were, what Goldsmith had said. But she was willing to say it under oath if subpoenaed. Right. That would not have the same implications for her career. And if she came and told that, that would substitute for the documents. They weren't going to get the documents. Mm-hmm. But Elizabeth Wilmshurst, the top legal officer, was going to come in and say, the war is illegal in my judgment, and I was the top legal expert on this subject. And that would have made a difference in England, though not the U.S. Now,
so it's interesting that
law had actually prevailed, if the rule of law had prevailed, which the U.S. is totally contemptuous of in terms of international law, and this president is pretty contemptuous of domestic law and the Constitution, as was, let's say, Cheney. But if a rule of law had prevailed, it would have kept the U.S. and U.K. out of this aggressive crime against the peace. Would that have been bad for England? Bad for even the U.S.? It would have saved us from that. as it could have saved us from some of the other interventions. But that's almost never brought out by the press or the Constitution. There are certain benefits in observing a rule of law when it comes to aggression.
Ben Emerson, by the way, is Katharine's lawyer, and Goldschmidt was the Attorney General. And without giving away the whole film, essentially they were able to show, and I want to ask you later about the necessity of defense. So let's leave that for then. Dan, I want to tell you that I absolutely agree with you that Trump's motives, by the way, in this Ukraine thing are not pure. I've never suggested that. I think he's as corrupt as they can come. But I'm saying both of them should fall, if anyone, Biden and Trump, because they both did the same thing, essentially.
Okay with me.
That's what.
Not my candidate in this election. Unless he were nominated by the Democrats, which I would deplore. And then I would have to say, less bad than Trump. But I hope very much that he does not get the nomination.
Elizabeth, do you have any follow-ups? Yes.
I would like to move on to the Espionage Act, because right now we have so much going on in that regard. And I'd like to ask Katharine about the parallels she sees with her case, in the US with Daniel Hale right now being prosecuted under the Espionage Act. We have Julian Assange probably being prosecuted under the same act, if he is extradited to the United States. I wanted to ask you about that, and also ask you as a follow-up to that discussion, is it more dangerous to leak now than it was in 2003, and where are we headed in that sense?
Well, I think Dan probably knows more about the Espionage Act than I do. But, I think the terms espionage don't apply, it seems to me, to either Daniel Hale or to Julian Assange. Julian Assange is essentially a one-man publishing unit. I mean, okay, maybe he isn't a one-man. In fact, it's the entire WikiLeaks, and there are several people involved. Unfortunately, he became the sort of this lightning rod for the organization. The evidence of his supposed espionage is so vague and, unsubstantiated that I don't think it could stand up in a court of law for more than half an hour. So clearly it is a politically motivated thing. And the espionage sort of term is totally out of context. None of these people have been giving or selling classified information to the enemy. That's not what they've done, right? So, it's shocking.
And I don't want to focus only on the Espionage Act. Obviously, the Official Secrets Act is at play in your case. And we also, in Australia, we see the prosecution of this witness K, who is also a whistleblower. So it seems to be a problem, essentially, that has grown across the West in general. And that's why I wanted to ask you, do you think that problem is intensifying and getting worse? Or do you, where do you think we're headed in terms of whistleblowers being politically prosecuted, the victims of lawfare, arguably?
I think it's looking bleak right now. I mean, unless we have some serious political changes on the ground in both the UK and the US, we're heading in extremely toxic direction. And it's a global thing. It's not just in the UK and the US. It's just this gradual shift, it seems, towards increasingly more authoritarian, increasingly more fascist types of government. And so all the sort of cries of they're against us for our democracy, and they're against us for our freedom, and all those sorts of jingoistic charges are a sham, quite frankly, because democracy is fallen by the wayside in a lot of these cases. It's really shocking that all of these laws are just being trampled on. None of it is taken seriously anymore. So it's not good unless we have some serious political changes on the ground.
Dan, did you want to comment on that?
I want it to be clear before we finish here that as I listen to Katharine Gun, Katharine has been a hero of mine since before I knew her name, from the time the Observer published that, and I didn't know who it was. And all the more so when I hear her speak, and a tremendous spokesperson for these issues and for democracy and freedom of speech. And I agree definitely with everything she said. We don't have an official Secrets Act in this country for two reasons. We haven't been an empire as long as the British. For the last couple of hundred years, our emulation of the British Empire has been pretty strong, but the British have been at the game for a long time, and they still have the traits of it to a considerable extent, and an official Secrets Act is one of those traits. An empire necessarily governing other people, ruling other people against their consent, essentially uses illegal means to the extent there is international law, and to an illegal purpose, basically an imperial purpose. We had a revolution against that empire, the first national war of national liberation in the world, and we have a First Amendment, which Britain doesn't. And that has kept us from having an explicit, formal, official Secrets Act, which criminalizes any and all release of protected, secret information, classified information. We don't have that. Despite many, many, many leaks before I was prosecuted. In my case, when I put out 7,000 pages of top secret documents, the government experimented with using another act, the Espionage Act, which was meant for spies and was often used against spies, never against someone who was giving information to the American public. That was done for the first time in my case. Then 2 times mine was dropped for reasons of governmental misconduct against me. There were 2 other cases before President Obama. Obama brought 9 such cases, and Trump has brought 8 in his first 2 years compared to Obama's 8 years. So we're obviously moving in the direction of using the Espionage Act as if it were an official Secrets Act. But in one respect, no one had yet dared to do that fully. Nixon tried with the New York Times, but dropped that. Trump is obviously has been predicted to move toward including journalists, as is true in Britain, as a defendant in these cases for criminal prosecution. If he succeeds, Assange is the first such indictment of a clear, as Katharine said, publisher of information here, to use him as a middle ground here. He's widely reviled for all kinds of reasons in this country. So a perfect, and some journalists are even willing to say he's not a real journalist and not go to his defense. So he's a perfect first case for them to bring to go against journalists. But if they succeed in getting him over to this country by extradition and trying, he will not be the last tried. So there will be a definite move toward the secrecy system of Imperial Britain, or formerly Imperial Britain. And that means more wars like Iraq, more wars like Vietnam, like Syria, and many others, where covert intervention and Iran. The need right now in this country is for a Katharine Gun who has access to contingency plans against Iran, which would be a sheer crime against the peace, a war of aggression, like Iraq, which was absolutely that, and even more disastrous in the region and the world against Iran than against Iraq. We're heading, in other words, toward a catastrophe which John Bolton, formerly just fired, was pushing for, and which the president seems open to and is certainly threatening. No one is confronting him in this country and say, what do you mean with regime change in Iran? That is a pure illegal imperial operation. And the idea of regime change is almost the definition of empire, a sense of legitimacy in deciding who runs other countries and deciding it by covert means or by fire and sword, fire and fury, as Trump likes to say. So all of this is not only illegal, and here is a correspondence with Katharine's position. I notice she's often portrayed, and correct me if I'm wrong, Katharine, as being primarily focused on the illegality of the war. But supposing the war had been authorized by the UN after arm twisting by the US, as in the case of the Gulf War and other things. Then, supposing that the bribery and the threats had been successful and they got it, would that have made the war a good idea? Or other than a crime against humanity, it might not have been illegal in international terms. It would have been a disaster. And the same would be true in Iran. So it is certainly worth the risks that Katharine ran and Mordecai Vanunu experienced in 11 and a half years in prison. What was that? I think it was even more than that in prison. I think it was 10 and a half in isolation, 17 years in totally for revealing that Israel's nuclear policy and capability. And Ed Snowden, Chelsea Manning, and so forth. These are real serious risks, absolutely. And in fact, Katharine and I are among the very few whistleblowers whose marriage did not dissolve. I want to congratulate you and Yasser, Katharine, because that's another thing we share. Patricia and I were brought closer together, if anything, by our collaboration on that. Yasser was collaborating with you from the moment he knew that you were the source, and he didn't reveal it. He was complicit in the trial, not just for a matter of deportation, and that brought you closer together. So congratulations. But the risks are terrible. Most people they destroy marriages, among other, as well as permanent exile like Ed Snowden, 7.5 years in prison for Chelsea Manning, etc. The risks are terrible. But where a war's worth of lives is at stake, or as Katharine has pointed to, democracy, law, rule of law, constitutional aspects, of course it can be worth risking that or even sacrificing that. And that's a lesson that I would hope from Katharine's movie and more books come out on that will reveal to whistleblowers in Britain and America, no more poodles in the alliance. What will the NATO countries do, the other NATO countries, if the US commits a war of aggression against Iran? I asked that question in Germany back in 2006, when the words first came out that Cheney, Vice President Cheney, was pushing very heavily for the use of nuclear weapons against Iran, and certainly against them. Can you be in an alliance with a major partner who is just committing a war of aggression, and not just illegal, not just aggression, but disastrous human consequences? As Katharine kept pointing out in the course of this, a disaster, whether legal or not. And the fact that it's illegal points to the fact that there's a way of stopping it if you take legality seriously. Turned out not to be enough. But all of it.
What did the Germans say?
Huh?
What did the Germans say?
Good question. I asked that of an audience and on television, and put it challenging to them. Could you remain in this alliance? I think the underlying thing would be from all polls that the population would be very much against it. But the leaders like Blair, and even like the coalition in Sweden right now, not the ruling party, not the Labour, Social Democratic Party, or Margot Wallström, the foreign minister, but they are anxious to be close to NATO and to the United States right now. Would they or would they not hurt that alliance? And it applies to any of them. I think the truth is the leaders would try to continue. They don't want light between them and the U.S. because the U.S. has so much to offer and so many ways of punishing all of them if they don't do it. And yet that should not apply to individual people in the government who put principle and human lives at a higher priority, as you did. And it should not apply to the population. There should be protests against that. And I hope there will be. I certainly don't count on it. But you and I and our friends, and Joe here, and others, are all, Elizabeth, are working to make that hope a reality, that we will successfully resist policies that would result in massive destruction.
Yes, well said.
Dan, that was a great summation, but I'm not done with you yet. I want to bring up the issue of the, I've heard you say it many times, and you just said it again, there is no Official Secrets Act in the U.S., but in researching a story about the history of the Espionage Act, I've learned that the act is derived from the March 1911 Defense Secrets Act, the U.S. Defense Secrets Act of 1911. And that is word for word based on Section 1 of Britain's Official Secrets Act of 1889. So the provenance of the Espionage Act is the British Official Secrets Act. That's, I said, Section 1 of 1889 Act is taken word for word into the 1911 Defense Secrets Act, which was then the basis of the Espionage Act. And then what I learned from the film, Catherine, which was interesting, which I did not know, was, and I happened to be in London the day of that debate in the Parliament, and I went to the public gallery to see the debate over the sinking of the Belgrano, the ship during the Falklands War. And that because of that, the act was revised and reenacted, was revised in 1989. Before we get into that, I didn't mention that when the Defense Secrets Act of 1911 came out in March, in August of 1911, the British Act was also revised. So in other words, there was play between the U.S. and Britain there. But then it was revised again in 1989 after the Belgrano. Could you talk a little bit about that and how significant that was in terms of the necessity defense, which I want to close with?
Well, the necessity defense, as far as I'm aware, was raised in the Shaler case in David Shaler, former MI5 whistleblower, who released information, amongst which there was information that MI6 had been planning on assassinating Colonel Gaddafi in Libya back in 1996 or something like that. But he released quite a lot of classified information. And in his case, I understand that the judge ruled there was a possibility for defense of necessity, but it didn't apply to him. So I think that gave Ben Emerson the idea that we could use it in my case. And even in my case, it would have been extremely difficult to prove because defense of necessity is usually used in much more mundane scenarios. Such as a fireman breaking into your neighbor's house in order to rescue somebody from your house, or so on and so forth. It's a destruction of property or something that is a crime in the attempt to save life. And so they would have had to have proved in my case that I believed the war was illegal at the time. And so that is where the Attorney General's advice would have come in, was that when I leaked it, his advice was also comparative with my belief, in that his advice was it would be illegal. I believed it was illegal, and therefore I was doing it in order to prevent the loss of life. And so, again, without going, I'm sure most people have read reviews about the film, and quite often they've basically told the ending of the story, and you can Google it and find out. But it was an anticlimax for me in some respects, dropping the case or whatever. It was, you can edit that out if you want, but it was an anticlimax because we had wanted to put the war on trial. It would have been an absolute prime opportunity to do that. And also to establish this potential defense within an act with no defense. The official secrets has no defense. And so if this had been set as a precedent, difficult though it would be as a precedent to be used, because it's not as broad as, say, a public interest defense, for example, it would still be a defense.
Were you shocked when you were standing there in court that they immediately dropped the case?
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, we did find out approximately 24 hours or maybe it was 48 hours beforehand. But it, being in the Old Bailey, one of the courts within the Old Bailey, I think there are 6 courts. It's pretty overwhelming. Standing behind a glass panel, the only one with everybody looking at you. So yeah, it was a shock, and the whole experience, it took me well over 2 years really to process it and to actually come to terms with it, I think.
Were you pleased with the film? Is it by and large accurate?
Yes, I mean all the key facts are accurate. Those things did happen. It feels different because obviously it is different. In the sense that I can't remember exactly what I said, and some of the sort of the scenes are different, the settings are different. But I'm glad that it came out in this version, and I'm glad that this is how the film evolved. I mean, it took a long time to get to this point, but I'm happy that it happened this way, because now I'm pleased to sign my name to it, basically, and to support it.
Of course, you've watched that film unlike any other human being on earth, so you have a very quite a unique perspective on that. I left the cinema trembling. It was such an emotional, powerful experience, far better than I had expected. I did not think it would be such a great, magnificent film. Probably Dan agrees with that. I guess we could forget about my point, but wasn't there something about the Belgrano mentioned in the film that changed necessity defense, that the government would decide?
I happen to know that one. It's in the book. The Belgrano was a Argentinian battleship, which was sunk by the British, and allegedly on the grounds that it was moving toward the British carriers and threatened them with possible torpedo attack or otherwise. And so in self-defense, they had to sink it. In fact, as Clive Ponting revealed, who'd been an insider on this, they knew that the Belgrano was moving away, was not only outside the zone, which had been described as a zone of defense there, it was outside it and it was moving away. It was a straight lie. And despite the fact, nevertheless, it was classified, but the judge virtually gave a directed verdict to the jury, in effect saying, look, the act just says, was it classified or not? It was, he revealed it. He virtually said he's guilty. And yet, on the basis of a public interest defense, I think it was not, the word necessity was not used. And remember, this is all after the fact that he's bringing that. He's not trying to prevent an imminent disaster. He's telling the truth about something that happened. So necessity defense would not be very available to him, but public interest, that it was to know that the government had lied about this act, misled the public. The jury thought that was in the public interest, and they acquitted Ponting despite his apparently clearly having violated the act, which at that time, however, did permit a public interest defense to be raised. So the effect afterwards was that they removed the public interest effect from the law, so that by the time of Katharine Gun, that no longer existed. Now, it's never existed with the Espionage Act, using that as an Official Secrets Act. Like the current British Official Secrets Act, it's what they call strict liability. No intent, no element of intent or motive is relevant. So the defendant cannot say, here's what I was trying to achieve, here's the harm I was trying to prevent, here's the lack of harm that actually resulted. None of that can be presented to the jury. That's true now in the Official Secrets Act, and it's true in our Espionage Act, which means that it cannot give a fair trial, allow a fair trial to Assange or to any of the ones who were brought under that act. To the people who've been brought did not get a fair trial. They were not able to tell the jury even why they had done what they did. There clearly should be a public interest defense. The Harvard law professor Yochai Benkler has pressed for this in law reviews for some time, that there should be a public interest. Obviously, that is true. When Ed Snowden says that he'd be willing to come and stand trial at risk to himself of whatever, with a fair trial, he's referring very specifically to changes in the law that would permit a public interest defense and allow him to present an actual defense in front of the jury.
Right. I think there is room for that. There is a need for that because each case, it should be judged on a case-by-case basis.
But I've tried to introduce I've been arrested in civil disobedience over 80 times, through about 40 trials. And in many of those trials, including as an expert witness, we tried to present, and once in a while did present, a necessity defense. It's at the judge's discretion whether he feels that defense could sway a jury, and he need not allow it at all. And usually they don't, because when it is presented, namely, here's why I did what I did, here are the evils I'm trying to combat, juries acquit. And judges don't want that, and prosecutors don't want that. So I'm very familiar with that defense. And as I looked, I have an affidavit on it that's been presented in a number of trials in support of presenting that defense. And what I was struck looking at Katharine's case was, and this was the brilliance of Ben Emerson, she was almost uniquely trying to prevent an evil, a wrongful war, not only terribly disastrous, and also illegal. All wars kill people, but illegal wars, it's not permitted for your leaders to kill people illegally. And it's rare that you can get such a clear-cut judgment on that. That was true in Iraq. It was clearly illegal and was going to be disastrous, and it was imminent. And it was almost certain to occur if she didn't take some kind of action to avert it. The action she took had, and this is where I started in our discussion, had a realistic basis for hoping that it would avert the war. She really did. I don't think that's true of any other act of civil disobedience or truth-telling that I can remember. You had the perfect case for a necessity defense. And you might or might not have won with it, but you had a very strong case. And they were very right not to let that come in, because it would have brought into effect the illegality of the war. You couldn't prove that it was going to be the disaster that it was. After all, some people over here thought it would be like a cakewalk, they said, in the Gulf War. But you could show that whether it was a cakewalk or not, it was a crime of aggression. And that's where Elizabeth Wilmshurst would have been absolutely critical. The documents would have been critical if you could get them, but you couldn't get them. Just asking them doesn't give them to you. Elizabeth Wilmshurst would do that, and I know that she was willing to risk her career if subpoenaed and ordered to give the truth under oath. And she could then stand up to her colleagues in Chatham House and saying, I really had no choice. They asked for the truth. I swore to give it, and I did.
Interestingly, though, have any of you seen the article that was published in The Guardian about a couple of weeks ago with the then Crown Prosecutor Ken MacDonald arguing that it was a matter of national security why they dropped the case?
That was one of the things I was going to ask you about, actually, was whether or not you thought that was, basically how ridiculous do you think that excuse was? And I thought that was a very interesting interview that he gave.
When I saw that, my immediate reaction was, oh, that's just a blanket cover for anything. They can just use national security for absolutely whatever they feel like. But then I thought about it for a while, and it occurs to me that they might actually be telling the truth, that it's national security. I mean, in the article, he argues that it would be, they were fearful that I would have been faced with an unfair trial, as we've been speaking about. Interestingly enough, they were so concerned that I would face an unfair trial. Now, what I'm now wondering, in fact, about the national security angle is, were they in fact trying to cover the relationship between GCHQ and NSA, the extent to which they cooperate, the extent to which they're almost umbilical in the way they do business, and the scrutiny that would have involved? Who is okaying these actions that are coming, almost, direct emails from NSA, from Frank Koza to head of our sections GC7 in Cheltenham, GCHQ, and emailing down to the 100 or so analysts in the office. Who's giving authorization for that in the UK? And is anybody giving the authorization for that? And then that leads into, because this was all pre-Snowden, pre-Thomas Drake and Bill Binney, the whole massive data collection and surveillance of both sides of the pond, and the collaboration that was clearly going on at this time. So I think there may be actually an ounce, or perhaps more than an ounce, of truth in their claim that it is because of national security.
And do you think that would have been a legitimate, case of national security, or do you think it's more kind of covering up politically, maybe politically sensitive ties between the UK and the US intelligence services?
Oh, absolutely. I think it is politically sensitive. I mean, since the Snowden revelations, it's almost like, why do they need to be sensitive? Because we know now. But at the time, if they're arguing that at the time the decision they took was based on national security, that was pre-revelations from Snowden. So that's arguably true. Of course, the other things are just, that I'm sure they came into consideration as well. The fact about the Attorney General's advice, the fact about defense of necessity being a possible precedent, the fact that potentially a jury wouldn't convict. And eventually, it was the issue of the election that Britain was coming up. The case would have carried on through the whole of 2004, and the trial rather, and Tony Blair and the country was facing a national election in 2005, I believe. So it would have dragged on. Many revelations potentially would have come out about the run-up to the Iraq War and Tony Blair's complicity in it. And obviously that would have looked incredibly bad in an election year. So there were many things that they were considering at the time. Joe?
You wonder why they didn't think of that before they prosecuted you.
Well,
It could come to that. Okay, speaking about the relationship between the NSA and the GCHQ, a very strange thing happened yesterday at the United Nations. Both Donald Trump and Boris Johnson, who at that time, when we're recording this on Wednesday, he's still the prime minister, he made his speech to the UN, and both of them went after Google and other social media companies and explained that this was the real problem. And I just want to quote Johnson. He says, "You may keep secrets from your friends, your parents, your children, your doctor, even your personal trainer. But it takes real effort to conceal your thoughts from Google. And if that is true today, in future, there may be nowhere to hide. This technology could be used to keep every citizen under round-the-clock surveillance. A future Alexa will pretend to take orders, but this Alexa will be watching you, clucking her tongue and stamping her foo. In the future, voice connectivity will be in every room and almost every object. Your mattress will monitor your nightmares. Your fridge will beep for more cheese." Classic Boris Johnson. But I mean, this is already happening. Seems to be a classic case of totally deflecting from the NSA and the GCHQ, which are essentially doing this massive surveillance. What did you make of this, Catherine and Dan? I just had to throw that in there because I was flabbergasted by this.
I have to be honest, I didn't hear that exchange. So it's, as I'm flabbergasted. It's
I'm sorry, it wasn't
that,
an exchange. It was a Trump speech early in the morning and then Johnson's late at night. They were totally separate speeches, but it seems to have been coordinated in some way that they both deflected from their own electronic signals agencies. I don't know.
Look, Joe, as you say, this is not a dystopian nightmare. This is, I mean, in the future, this is it right now. They have that information right now. Why did the U.S. want a surge of surveillance against the 6 non-permanent members, the swing votes on the permanent? It's understood, as Catherine brought out, to blackmail them, to manipulate them, not only to blackmail, to know what to offer to them, to know who to get rid of.
I mean, in the email, it actually, in the email, it actually says alliances and dependencies. You know, so
the home offices and everything. So why did they want that? Well, to manipulate it, as very clearly, the U.S. and the U.K. and their other partners, the BND in Germany and so forth, have this information. They share it. They have it. They have it on all of us, as you were saying, right now, as we speak, right now. This is Ed Snowden's point in his new book, Permanent Record. They not only have it, they now have the storage capacity to keep it forever and bring it up when they want. Does this not give them the basis for what the Stasi, the secret police in East Germany, aimed at? Total information, total control? Yes. They're not using it yet to put people, to deport people en masse or to put them in camps yet, as they do, or, you know, torture, kill, whatever, as happened in East Germany. But that could be instituted from one night to the next with another big terror attack, for example, in either country. Or it doesn't have to be as big as 9/11, or a war and resistance to that war and protest to the war. We could suddenly see police state methods being put into operation overnight. And almost nobody is doing anything to rein that in at all. Many resolutions raised after Snowden, that would be his necessity defense. Look, I got discussion of this, you know. But then you could say, did you have a real reason to believe that would change the surveillance? Does he really believe it? Maybe. I don't think so. It hasn't yet. The resolutions have not changed the surveillance yet. And that's 6 years after Snowden made those revelations.
Well, he mentions in his book, doesn't he, that as a result, he reckons of his exposures that the US brought in the USA Freedom Act in 2015. Do you think, you know, that is a promise, if you like, that they will not do bulk collections of US phone records? Do you think they can actually circumnavigate that? And, you know,
in theory, a lot of the information is being left with the companies like Google and Amazon and the telephone companies now, rather than going directly to NSA. I question very much whether they think that keeps them from having it when they want it, pretty much. Maybe there's been a change. I doubt that there's been any significant change until now. And
well, I mean, if the UK is collecting it, then presumably it's all right? If the UK is collecting the phone records of US citizens, that it's not breaking any laws in that respect.
Are they not? I mean,
well, if I was just saying, if no. You know, and they were just swapping, you know, so that we'll collect yours and you collect ours, and then we're not breaking our own laws, you know.
By the way, well, it's rarely mentioned, why did the U.S. need help from GCHQ to listen in to people in New York at the UN? Rarely looked at. It's because by 3 different treaties, we're forbidden the U.S., to listen in to the UN, especially because we're the host company. So we get the British to do it. In other words, it would be clearly illegal for us to do it in several ways. And it's illegal for the British too. But it's not illegal for us to ask the British to do it. Apparently, they tried to think of it that way. But, something we haven't discussed here that I'm afraid one little limitation of the film is, and less of the book, is the discussion of the total blackout in the U.S. about the case. The very leak in the first instance on March 1st of the Frank Koza cable, absolutely not covered in this country, in the U.S. Martha Mitchell, the author of your book, conjectures that maybe there was some directive coming to that. I don't feel that's a conjecture. I think that's almost certainly the case, that NSA and maybe even the White House was answering New York Times queries on that day and elsewhere by saying, stay away from this. It's communications intelligence. This is hot here. And by the way, we do have an Official Secrets Act for communications intelligence. It would cover what you revealed. In fact, you would have been, you would have been subject to an Official Secrets Act in this country. We have an act for that. It criminalizes all of it. That too should have a public interest defense, but it doesn't. And so I suspect they actually threatened, if you print that memo, you would be subject to prosecution, even as journalists. Now, it had never happened, but they never had anything this hot. There wasn't anything like that in the 7,000 pages of the Pentagon Papers. There was no cable like that, nearly as clearly illegal, but in particular, communications intelligence and also operational communications intelligence. That's what struck me, when I read that. I thought, wow, this is covered by clearance that even I didn't have, and the even I in the Pentagon, and I had a dozen clearances, compartmented clearances higher than top secret, but I didn't have one for operational communications intelligence. Who do we target? How do we do it? Where do we do it? With what effect? All I could see, which was higher than top secret, was what do we get from it? And by the way, as far as I know, Katharine, maybe you know, but to this day, has it come out whether Frank Koza's, almost surely Frank Koza's request for help was accepted by GCHQ? I think you can almost take that for granted. How much did they do? What did they get? What did they find on these people? How did they use it? I don't think any of that has ever come out, has it?
No. As far as I know, no.
Interesting stuff. As somebody says, nobody's even interviewed Frank Koza. He's this mythical person. And it wouldn't be that hard to follow up. I don't think that's...
Actually, funnily
I'll go
enough,
looking for him, Dan.
Well, today I got on my public Facebook page, I got a comment from somebody. I can't remember who it was exactly, but they said, I went to school in 1968 with a kid called Frank Koza.
Okay. What kind of a kid was he? Now, what we're interested in is to talk to him right now. And the question raises, he was asking for illegal advice. Americans don't worry about prosecution for that, and they're right not to worry. He's in no risk.
Koza, of course, was the NSA. He wrote the memo, or he's mentioned in the memo, Captain.
He wrote
asking.
The memo.
Of course, he will never speak now, Dan. That's still classified. I mean, this is the way. Even if something is leaked to the public, they still consider it classified, so they can hide behind that and say, "I can't speak about it." Right?
Yeah. Listen, the Pentagon Papers were officially declassified on the 40th anniversary of my release of them. Okay.
There you go. There you go. Perfect example of that.
Man, anyone is much subject to prosecution as I've been. In theory, as much subject. If you gave a copy of the Pentagon Papers to your spouse as a Christmas present, some people even did that, that would be distributing classified information. You were subject to, under the word of the Espionage Act, to prosecution.
That's how absurd the Section E of that Espionage Act is, that just the mere possession and dissemination in any way by sending an email with the WikiLeaks document attached to it, that's breaking the Espionage Act.
Likewise, the Official Secrets Act.
Yeah, yes, it is. Yeah.
The Official Secrets Act, which I contend is the basis of the Espionage Act in terms of its provenance through the Defense Secrets Act, and therefore we have an Official Secrets Act, Dan, and we don't have a public interest defense in that.
I'm impressed by your scholarship here, and I'm not aware of the 1911 law, but I do know very well the 1917 law, which I was prosecuted under, with its amendments, which were very critical in 1950 in the McCarthy period, and this was specifically by Pat McCarran, but that we were prosecuted under. I question whether the wording of the 1911 Act is fully used in the 1917 Act. The fact is that there were a lot of people who wanted to said in the time, the legislative history of the 1917 Act, which was passed in the immediate aftermath of coming into World War I as an Espionage Act, they said, we don't want a British Official Secrets Act. And they were assured that they didn't have it, although the wording of it, oddly, and this is always described as puzzling, but oddly, it does seem as though they came close to writing one, an Official Secrets Act, but they definitely said that was not their intention.
Yeah, and they defeated Wilson in trying to get formal censorship into that act.
Yeah.
But here's Assange now, this is what I want to close with, who has been charged under this. The first journalist for possession and dissemination of classified information. Other journalists had been prosecuted under the Espionage Act for resisting the draft when it first came out in World War I era. But this is the first time a journalist has been charged in this way. We know from Dan that in the Pentagon Papers case, Nixon actually impaneled a grand jury in Boston and was trying to indict the two New York Times reporters. They pulled back when Dan's case collapsed because they asked whether they had been wiretapped as well. And apparently FDR tried to do this. It's from Chicago Tribune reporter back during the war. And then there was Obama, who went as close as they could to indicting Assange, pulled back, realizing even though technically Assange has broken this law, they knew that if it were challenged successfully or in any way as it violating the First Amendment, they could lose this. And that's what needs to be challenged now. And maybe that'll come out of the Assange case. But I want to ask whether Assange certainly cannot use a necessity defense or a public interest defense if he comes here to Alexandria to be charged. But what about in his extradition case? He's in the UK now, where we saw Katharine Gun was able to use a necessity defense. Could his lawyers try to say that he published, not leaked, he published the Afghan and Iraq war logs to prevent further bloodshed? Katharine tried to prevent it from starting. Assange tried to prevent it from carrying on, just like you did, Dan, with the Vietnam War. Why couldn't, I'd ask both of you this, why couldn't his lawyers use this in the extradition proceeding?
The case you've made is the case that I and others have made repeatedly for acts of civil disobedience of various kinds. And of course, this truth-telling, whether by an official violating the rules, if not the laws, governing them, of putting out secret truths that the government doesn't want out, or a journalist who's putting it out. The difference, the case is there. You say you didn't have another way of averting this greater evil, this disaster that might be looming. A question arises very often of whether it's said to be imminent. Well, if it's ongoing, like the murder, the collateral murder that Assange revealed, having been given it by Chelsea Manning, the video showing clear-cut war crimes that were not prosecuted and that we had the evidence for. You could say, well, this is an ongoing process. One person on the scene said this is an everyday process. So you could say it's ongoing. That sets the imminent aspect. You're trying to protect lives, that is, of non-combatants who are being deliberately targeted by these people. You have that case. How about the chance that, this is where the defense often comes down. Was there a reasonable chance that this act of whether sitting in a draft board, refusing to cooperate with the draft, or coming in and occupying a missile base, as the Plowshares group does, or in my case, putting out secrets, is there reason to believe that it will have an effect in averting the evil? Well, that's often hard to demonstrate, especially for these. In Katharine's case, almost uniquely, she had a very strong case on that. That's very rare. And on the other hand, when I say I've made this affidavit, it's to this effect for people to use. It has been used in trials, actually. This person in doing a draft raid or whatever, I'm thinking of a friend named Frank Kroenke who was involved in destroying draft files, or sitting in at a draft office, or stopping a troop train or something like that. Could that have any effect on ending a war? Well, the individuals had to think very minute, but not zero. They were doing what they could. Could it have actually an effect? And what I said was this: the Pentagon Papers release has been described in courts and elsewhere as, quote, arguably having an effect on ending the war, shortening the war. It certainly didn't end the war very quickly. It went on 4 years afterwards. But it played a role in events that led to the ending of the war. That's the Pentagon Papers. Most people don't have 7,000 pages of top secret history to put out. But I would not have done that flatly, would not have done that without the example of people who were simply sending their draft card back to their draft board and going to prison for it, like Randy Keeler and many others, Bob Eaton, many others who did draft resistance, which individually was unlikely to have an effect, but was indispensable in having an effect on me and challenging me to think, how can I, with my safe full of records of lies and broken treaties and disaster in my safe, how could I perhaps shorten this war now that I'm willing to go to prison as they are? And that's the effect that a Katharine Gun can have, in addition to her real prospect of stopping that war. She had a real prospect, didn't happen, but did prevent it from being legitimized in general. Not sure that counts for a whole lot, but she had it. But in addition to that, her example and her demeanor, look at her, listen to her. If this person can do it, well, maybe I can do it. That's the danger that they always face putting her on trial. I suspect, by the way, that's why it took them 8 months to decide whether to put him on trial. Do we want this person to get all this attention and reveal to the police that following your conscience is something you can do if lives are at stake, even if it puts you in court and in prison? And presenting that idea is what I'm saying can be part of a chain of events, a chain of actions that actually do have a major effect. Look at Greta Thunberg right now. She didn't just demonstrate, she didn't just march, though she did do that. She struck from school. She left school on a weekday, a Friday morning, to sit in front of the Swedish parliament and saying, strike for climate. And within months of that, 1.5 million people, school children all over the world, 120 countries, this is going back now, left school, struck. This is civil disobedience, in effect. All teachers are saying, you're going to lose credit, come back. Their parents are saying, you're going to be kicked out, and so forth. And what happened just a week or so ago? Millions of people in most countries of the world. That started with 16-year-old Greta Thunberg. I just looked up Joan of Arc, by the way, yesterday because somebody called her Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc was 16 when she started her campaign. She was 19 when she was burned at the stake. She was 18. It's the same age as Greta. And she began getting her visions, by the way, of saving France from British control when she was 10. Greta started when she was 9 on climate. Katharine here was older, but not over the hill, as I was.
I'm going to give you the last word, Katharine. Greta is an extraordinary young woman, and she stood up to those leaders and told them exactly to their faces what they needed to hear. Katharine, The last word.
My last word.
Yes.
For now.
Can you follow up what Dan was saying? Is that possible?
Well, I just wanted to say one thing now that Dan is here and it's public. I was hugely relieved, and I don't know, I just wanted to express publicly that Dan was a huge, what am I trying to say? A source of comfort for me, because, you know, when my name came out, when I was charged and it became public and people knew who I was, I got a huge amount of support actually from the US. People wanted to send in emails. So my email account got, you know, inundated with hundreds of emails from US citizens and from people around the world as well, supporting me, and, you know, and that was a huge amount of comfort. But, you know, Dan has always been there at the side of everybody who's come out and come public and supported them and advised them and stood up for them. And so I just want to make a, you know, public announcement that, you know, we couldn't have done it without your support.
I love to hear that. I'm delighted to hear that. That's wonderful feedback. I didn't know it. From my reading last night, Martha Mitchell, who wrote this book, which I recommend people reading, by the way, The Spy Who Tried to Stop a War, the new edition of it, she does say in her epilogue, written recently now, that knowing your desire for privacy and your inner shyness, which doesn't come out in public, but which she asserts, nevertheless, she wishes that the world heard more from you, and that you overcame that, and that we benefited more from your speaking on this issue. And I will join her in that, as on this program, Joe. But yes, that would be wonderful if, like Snowden from Moscow, you from Turkey could be heard more all over the world.
We're so glad that we did hear from Katharine Gun today, and from you, Dan Ellsberg, and I thank you too, Elizabeth Voss. We're moving on to the next story. You're watching CN Live.